Hello and welcome to NARC Live on Wednesday the 18th of January 2023, coming to you live from Norfolk on the east coast of England with Tammy M0TC.
Hello.
And me, David G7RP. Lovely to see you. On tonight's show, Frank K4FMH joins us with a revolutionary alternative to Sunspot cycle prediction. Where on earth is this? And do you know what, Tammy? If we were running a caption competition, wouldn't that be just begging out for a caption?
It would, wouldn't it?
If you are sharp on your keyboards at home and you want to give us a suitable caption for that, I don't see why we can't just add that to it.
Impromptu.
Impromptu. So if you want to suggest any captions, have a close look at that.
You got 1 minute to think of
and
something.
And you've got about a minute,
yeah,
something like that. All right. And so where on earth is this and what on earth is this? We'll find out.
Well, and also, if you have any ideas what that is,
well, yes, of course, you're quite right.
You've got maybe 3 minutes.
Yeah,
for that.
We've only had 2 entries for this week by email, so you've got a good chance if you put it onto Facebook or BATC, and we'll read out your answers in a moment. But we start with club news and an update on contesting from Malcolm G3PDH. He says that 2023 has started off with the AFS, the Affiliated Societies Contest, in January, which covers CW, Data and SSB. So far, we've done the CW and Data, with SSB due to take place this coming Saturday. Sounds like a plug to me. Being SSB, we invite as many members as possible to give it a try, for which the details can be found on the RSGB HF contest website, which, by the way, is at rsgbcc.org. But in summary, it's from 1300 to 1700 and on both 40 metres and 80 metres this Saturday. The results have been published from the CW session, and NARC came a creditable 5th place for Team A in the local club section out of 49 entries. NARC had 13 members taking part, and in this contest the scores are registered in groups of 4, i.e. the 4 highest being Team A, the second 4 in Team B, and so on. Team B came 11th, Team C 26th, then a single station entry for Team D at 49th. The data contest took place last Sunday, and we await the final placings for that. Many thanks to all that took part for NARC. The club championships start again in February with 3 contests per month, SSB, CW and Data, through to the end of July. The first one is SSB on February the 6th. These take place on 80 metres, and again full details can be found on the RSGB HF contest website, rsgbcc.org. Anyone wishing to take part, and if you're new to contesting, then please contact Malcolm G3PDH on this email address, g3pdh@btopenworld.com. These details are also on the club website. NARC has also seen an increase in activity levels for the VHF and UHF contests, and this may interest you. It's been moving up the tables gradually, so if anyone would like to take part in those contests for VHF and UHF, please contact Phil, G4LPP, and his email address is thedoctorphil, all one word, @gmail.com. But again, his details are on the newsletter and on the club website every week. Now, an email from Mark, G0TMT. I read that somebody has come up with the idea of a group project, and I'd like to put forward a project that was published in Radcom in September 2021. I think we can quickly show you a preview of that here. This is the High Performance Loop Amplifier by John Hawes G8CQX. I personally use an active loop receive antenna on HF, as they are much quieter than my main HF inverted L antenna. Mine doesn't use this amplifier, however, as I built a different one some time ago. I suspect that John's design would be superior to the one I built, but as I already have built 3 or 4 different loops and amplifiers, it's always interesting to read about a newer design. If any club member is a keen HF operator or listener and, like me, suffers from local RF noise from neighbours, then an active loop can make a significant difference. It's also an excellent broadband antenna for shortwave listening with an SDR or similar. In addition to the 2 designs enclosed, a builder will need to construct a simple bias T-circuit to power the amplifier up the coax cable, but this is a very simple construction. Many modern HF rigs have a separate receive antenna input on the back, but even if they don't, it's quite easy to construct a changeover device that activates with the PTT. So if the group decides to make them, and that's you now watching what Mark has written this for, what is to say this is an idea for a club project. So if you like the idea of this, you need to tell us, because as he says, if several of us get involved with building this, we can group by the PCBs and other components to make it easier. We can also, of course, help, because this does use some surface mount technology, but that does not need to be a frightening thing. And of course, we can help you build this at the club. So we can buy the quantities of 5, 10, or even 20, but we do need to hear from you. So if you think this is a great idea, and I think it's something that probably would interest most radio amateurs, building a magnetic loop type antenna and building the amplifier for it, then please let me know. You can either tell me at the club next Wednesday, or you can drop me an email to the usual address, which is radio@dcpmicro.com. It's on the screen now. Or get in touch with Mark, indeed. And if we can get several of us together, then we'll make it a club project. Unless you have any other ideas. It is the only idea I've received for a club project, which is a bit of a shame. What we're trying to do, just to remind you, is, when we do meet now at CNS regularly, roughly speaking every other week, sometimes we meet 3 times a month, depending on how the Wednesdays fall. We're trying to do, as well as the social activities, we're trying to actually have some projects and some roundtables and just things happening, really, because we are a radio club, and as well as socialising, it's nice to get involved with some projects, the sort of thing we can't do on programmes like this, on NARC Live. So we do really, really want your feedback, and I have put a few pieces in the newsletter in the last few weeks, and you're probably thinking that we get lots, but we don't actually, to be honest. So if you've got an idea for another project, let us know, or if you like the idea of Mark's project there, we will help you. I'm sure he will come along and help the club. I will certainly help people use, solder stuff. Maybe it's be the first thing you've ever made. It's the idea. Anyway, I think I've plugged it enough, but we do need to hear from you if you're interested in that. And finally, then back to this picture which we showed you at the top of the show. Let's have a look at this. Now, this came from Paul G3VPT, and he says, we've got the gas guys working in the village. You can make that up yourself at the moment, and thought this may be okay for the club. Well, I mean, where do we start? Have we got any captions firstly?
No, we haven't.
Really?
No.
Oh, that's a shame. Okay, well, I thought that, what do you say about that? You've got a WC one side, then a drying room next to it. Maybe this is a regular site and I'm just living a sheltered life. I don't know. There's actually another picture as well that Paul sent. This. Now that looks as if that's behind it. So we've got a WC, a drying room, and then the canteen in the back. Anyway, Paul, thanks very much for sharing.
I think it's a very good idea.
I thought we'd
There's quite a few of them on the A11 at the moment.
Is there? What, the same sort of thing?
Not that I vary in look when they...
Right. I hope there is a partition, though, presumably between the WC and the drying room.
I hope so.
Yeah, you don't go in one door and out the other.
No.
Anyway, we better keep it clean.
Can I just say, just got one thing back to that thing you're just talking about, the amplifier.
Mm-hmm.
Steve G0KY says, please make it clear that the loop is receive only.
Good point. Yes, thank you, Steve. Yes. As Mark actually did mention, some transceivers have separate sockets for receive errors and transmit, but this is receive only, so it's something that you just need for that. But a lot of us just receive anyway and use SDRs and experiment, and of course loops and things take a lot less space. But as I said, we would really love to hear from you. That's the main thing. If you'd like to do this, or if you've got an idea for a different project, get in touch, please, because we need at least sort of 4 or 5 people really to make something like this worthwhile.
Brian M7SEY says he thinks that'd be a really nice mobile shack. I suppose it would, because you've got a toilet, you've got a kitchen.
And a drying room.
And a drying room.
Which every shack needs a drying room.
That's right.
Okay, all right. Well, thanks very much for your comments so far. If you think of anything else, let us know and we'll try and come back to it later, but we mustn't keep our guests waiting too long. Anyways, Tammy, it's over to you now for Little People.
Yep. Those planes are around again. Can you hear them?
Yeah, they have. Yeah, they choose NARC Live.
Every Wednesday evening and everything. Right, here you go. It's really good for space watching at the moment, or stargazing, and you've got some really lovely clear nights. But really, did you know really that there's a comet around at the moment and it's a carrot?
No, I didn't. Is that maybe why that project failed?
Maybe.
That rocket.
Oh, the rocket, yeah. Do you think that's a tangerine?
Tangerine in the back, but what's the one on the front?
The sun, I mean.
Is that an artichoke or something like that?
They're rice cakes.
Rice cakes. Okay.
Didn't you know?
It's man-made.
That the moon was made of ice skates. I think actually that the moon is made of cheese.
I thought you were going to say that.
That's what Wallace and Gromit told me anyway.
Anyways, as always, it's ingenious and lovely to see these things from this Japanese website, miniature-calendar.com, a different picture every day. Tammy picks one for us as well. So what have you been doing? We only had a little bit of news really this week from Mark and from Malcolm and Paul, but we do love to hear from you. There's about 2 weeks now between now and when we meet again online, so please get in touch. Send us your pictures, your news, your views, or anything to do with radio or the club or anything you think will interest our viewers, and send them to this address, radio@dcpmicro.com. Thank you. Now round to that competition. And I was surprised at this. So can we see this, please?
We can.
I'm sorry.
You haven't said the word yet.
What? Oh, what on earth is this? Sorry, you're quite right. I should read the script that I wrote.
You should.
That I type out. Here we go. Now, I was surprised because I thought this was... Well, maybe it's because I knew what it was. It's one of those things, isn't it? But I thought this would attract a lot of attention. We only had 2 entries.
We've had another entry.
Oh, have we? Okay.
John 220TWQ says he thinks it might be a tile cutter.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, and we've got another one here, which is Kev M0KKM. Could it be a tool for fitting their mains cables, strain relief things into things, which they may want to remove them?
Right, okay. And by email, we got Colin M0GMK says, I think this is a strain relief bush insertion tool. And Heiko is the name that comes to mind. Yeah, that's a brand name that sort of did that sort of thing. And do you want to read the other one, or do you want me to do it?
You can.
And David G3VSJ says, now what is this? I think I have one somewhere, and I use it to fitting cord and cable grips, those horrible 2-part plastic things. No other entries, I don't think. So let's reveal what on earth this is.
It was a cable strain relief bush insertion tool.
And I couldn't find a proper name for it. So Heiko was the name, I think, of probably the inventors, and certainly the classic name that's associated with them. But that little white thing there, so you could probably tell what that is. But just in case you couldn't, I had a look in my equipment cupboard here, found this bit of equipment, and if I hold this up to the camera, you should be able to see, and you'll identify, I'm sure, the sort of thing that looks like. You see that there? What this thing here? And although you may think, well, why do you need a special tool for that? So I'll show you what it looks like if you've never seen one, and if you don't make stuff, you may not have done. This is what the actual thing looks like. So it looks a bit weird, and it's got this bit of plastic here. And what happens is the cable goes through it, and you actually sort of really need to compress it to grip onto the cable. So if I can show this, I maybe needed a landscape camera for this.
I think you need the white one.
That comes round. Yeah, that would have been easy, wouldn't it? I don't have one of those though. They're pretty rare. That bit comes across. Can you just see through that there? That's where the cable goes. This is why you need a special tool, because the tool compresses this to grip the cable, sort of puts a kink in it and holds it in, and then you end up with that little device there. And this tool, effectively, from the outside, if I was to do that, that might make more sense then. This is my version of the tool, very similar. Anyway, you probably didn't want a lesson on it, but it's quite nice when you show something like this, and you may have seen them on bits of equipment and not sure how you'd use one. They're pennies each. So in production, in manufacturing, they're really good. They're very effective, but they do squeeze the cable quite a lot, and they're pretty difficult to get out. And the fact is, once you push this in, of course, once you push this into a hole in the back of a chassis or a case, then it keeps the two together, so they can't come up. Anyway, that's it. Thank you very much to those who entered. Let's have a look and find out and ask you, what on earth is this? Or these? Have you any idea what they are for? Sent in by one of our members, as they always are. You've got 2 weeks to come up with what you think that is. Send your answers to radio@dcpmicro.com by 2 weeks today, by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But if you think you know now, why not write it in now?
Da, 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 da.
Thank you very much. So before we meet our guest tonight, let's just have a look at what's happening at the club this week. So on Saturday, as I mentioned earlier on in the contest news, we've got the AFS contest, SSB, so everybody can do that, between 1 o'clock and 5 o'clock on both 40 and 80 metres. On Sunday at 7 o'clock on GB3MB, we've got the GB2RS News. On Monday at 7:30, the Monday Night Net on GB3MB, and at 8:30, the 80 metre CW Net on 3.543 megahertz. And then next Wednesday, a week tonight, we meet again at CNS School between 7 and 9:30, and it's a social plus. After notices at 7:30 p.m. is an informal workshop on Norfolk repeaters with Mark G0LGJ from the Norfolk Repeater Group and James M0ZAH from Teamwave and their hybrid analog and digital repeaters GB3NZ and GB3VW. So an interesting evening there, very informal, not chalk and talk and that sort of thing and PowerPoint presentations, just sitting around a table and talking to these guys who know lots about many of the repeaters in Norfolk. And don't forget to keep in touch with us, as I said, for your news, views, your mystery objects. We'd love some more. We're running out now, actually, of mystery objects and tools and things like that. So don't forget to send some of those. And of course, then to mention this card, which we send nearly one. We've sent one this week. We will happily send this, our NARC card, to anybody who you feel will be cheered to hear from your club. We'll add your name to ours and send it to anyone in the world. Don't have to be NARC members. They don't even have to be a radio amateur. If you feel that a card from Norfolk Amateur Radio Club will cheer them up. This is the address, radio@dcpmicro.com. We look forward to hearing from you. Now it's time to meet our guest. Frank K4FMH has been studying things like sunspot cycles for ages, and you may have heard of Scott McIntosh and the kind of controversial sort of views that he has on propagation. There was a whole big article about this in Radcom last year. Well, I'm really pleased Frank is joining us now live from Mississippi. Sorry, Frank. Good evening.
Good evening, David and Tammy, and I'm delighted to be here with you. And it's a real pleasure anytime a group of people wants to subject themselves to your nattering about what you think is important. So it's a real pleasure to communicate and meet some of the members of your club tonight.
Yeah, well, it's lovely to see you, Frank. And as always, we're going to hand over to you for your presentation, and I'll let you introduce it and explain the background behind it. But anybody at home now, of course, if you have any questions or comments on what Frank says, just enter them at any time now on Facebook or on BATC, and we'll, of course, read those to Frank at the end. But now back to you, Frank, and we look forward to sharing some questions with you at the end.
Well, very good. Thank you very much. Again, my name is Frank Howell. I'm a retired professor from Mississippi State and an adjunct professor at Emory University. This title, appropriately, as you will learn even more as I begin to talk about it, Revolutionary Alternatives in Sunspot Prediction. Now, this is based on, as David said, a July and August 2022 issue of Radcom. It's a paper I co-authored with Dr. Scott McIntosh. Steve Nichols and the rest of the propagation committee at RSGB reviewed it. And in fact, it is a bit of a controversial approach, and we'll explain that here. Now, Dr. McIntosh is a leading solar physicist. He's located at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Colorado. As I mentioned, I'm Professor Emeritus at Mississippi State. Now, I'm not a solar physicist. I wave my arms and say that to you. But I am a statistician and a philosopher of science, and I've taught these subjects to PhD students and other faculty for several decades before retiring. I've been a consultant to many federal agencies on grant awards and scientific publishers on peer-reviewed books and journals. And I've worked with Scott since 2020 to learn more about his team's work. Some of you may recognize my name as one of the team members for the ICQ podcast that is out of London in Ireland. Martin Butler and his son Colin have been doing that for, I think about 14 years. I've been involved for about 12 years with them. The meat and potatoes of the Radcom article really came from Scott. I interviewed him on the ICQ podcast a few years ago, and that's how I met Scott. And we really hit it off and have become good friends, and we communicate almost daily. And so I'm not an expert in that field. but I feel like I've sit at the feet of a master who's one of the top solar physicists in the world at this point. My role in the Radcom papers was simply to take the trees and put them into the framework of a forest in terms of them struggling to get some of their theory and models published in peer-reviewed journals. I've started journals, been editor, and retired from Springer Media in the Netherlands, the largest scientific publisher in the world. So I've kind of been around that, and I've helped them with some of the approaches that they might take. I've also been able to frame that in how does it fit into how science changes in general. And I've also maybe made some recommendations on some statistical bases and approaches for some of their key elements. So Scott's the solar physicist, and I'm not. Here's the front page of the two Radcom issues. You may recognize those. Here's a summary of my talk, so you know where I'm at. Sunspots are what we call in the States the Dow Jones Industrial Index. You have a stock market in the United Kingdom. It's like the Dow Jones Industrial Index. We're faithful to a sine wave model of about 11 years. The official predictions, as you see them, are from a team put together temporarily every so many years by NASA and NOAA here in the States, and I said an international panel. So the main question is, how did we get this conception of an 11-year sunspot cycle? How do scientific paradigms compete with one another and change? There's a new competing paradigm proposed by the Macintosh team. Well, what's new about that? What does it do different? How does it view things differently than the official forecast? We're now finding ourselves in the 25th sunspot cycle. I want to compare the official predictions versus the Macintosh team. And we'll follow along and see. As the Beatles so eloquently wrote, say you want a revolution? Well, will there be a scientific revolution? And I'll articulate some thoughts about how that might happen. I apologize, this will be a little nuanced. Some of you may capture a bit of a nap, and I apologize for that, but you have to look at some of the details to make sense of it. So the present day sunspot cycle, in terms of sunspot occurrence, official predictions, and competing predictions, goes something like this. Here is our graph that looks at the official versus the Macintosh predictions, and then the actual observed ones from 2019 to projected out 2024. The two blue lines, the light teal line is the original NOAA, NASA, ISIS original predictions. They later wanted to restart their baseline, and they changed them about 6 months from when the cycle started. So they got a little adjustment here, kind of a mulligan in golf, if you want to think of it in those terms. So these are the two NASA NOAA predictions. The red line is the Macintosh and Bob Lehman, who's a professor and scientist at the University of Maryland working in solar physics. So you can see the red line and the two blue lines, well, they begin to get further and further apart as we go through this next cycle. The green line is simply the average sunspot cycle for each month going back to 1750, our entire record of measured sunspots. And so you can see that the Macintosh team's predictions are probably not too different than the average. The average has no explanation. It's just a statistical artifact. The Macintosh-Lehman projections actually have a theory and a model. Well, what's really been happening? The black line, buttressed by these green lines that jump all over the place here, these are the smooth or the observed monthly average sunspot cycle. So you can see the black lines. Well, it got in here and it kind of got below the Macintosh prediction. It went back up. It got low again. It went back up. It got low again. And some were saying, oh, the Macintosh model's failing. Well, then look what happened. For those who have looked at stock markets and have any statistical background will know this is sometimes thought of as a random walk. This isn't random, but you'll see this up and down, up and down, up and down in time series data. I want to make one point. When solar physicists use a smooth sunspot, I have a background in data visualization, given grant money and big computers to do some what they hoped was pioneering work back in the 90s. And so I'm very acutely attuned to smooth anything. It is for humans. It is not for the phenomena. So when we smooth some data points together, we're taking a lot of the wobblies, if you will, out of the daily observation so we can begin to see. If you took the black line out and you looked at these little green line things, it might be something that you would see on a TV show where a lie detector test is being given to somebody they think is not telling the truth. So this smooth line is often for us to see trends over time, for comparing one point to another. But in actual propagation, you're going to be influenced by what's going on daily. Now, as solar physicists will tell you, because there's a sunspot number that's, say, at 150 where I have my cursor, and then the one the next day is down below 25, that effect on our ionosphere is not instantaneous. So at times, it can take some time for that to occur. So many of them would argue that a smooth one is a better fit. You say potato, I say potato. There are reasons for using either one. So here's where we are. Well, why do we have these different projections? What do they mean? And what's the future going to be? And we'll talk about that. Sunspot cycles in amateur radio practice reflect our absolute loyalty to a paradigm of 11 years, even when we're faced with many anomalies in this. I'll give you an example. We have this famous website widget. I have it on one of my websites at K4FMH.com, solar terrestrial data. We who use HF look at this almost every day. We see a plethora of indices. We read to figure out what they mean. Well, what does that tell me? We have the author of this very famous widget makes a judgment. Okay, 80 through 40 is going to be bad during the day. It'll be good at night, and so on. It's a bit like testing your line for fishing. The forecast might be a terrible day, and you catch more than you ever have. It might be the great day, and you come up with nothing. So this is ubiquitous. How accurate is it for us? Wow, not really. But forecasting the sunspot number has been the chief element of concern since at least the 1940s. Over here on this side of the pond, the earliest ARL handbooks from 1940 forward, and related books like your own Steve Nicol over in the United Kingdom with the RSGB, written a very informative book on propagation. Another writer, Eric Nichols, here in the States, has written a book, and Carl Luschel-Schwab, who K9LA is a retired scientist. He is well thought of. He is the ARL's go-to person on propagation. All have books, and that is the prime focus. What do they focus on? They focus on the amplitude, how high the sunspot cycle is or how low the trough is, as well as when is one cycle going to morph into another. So the amplitude and the transition are the key elements of the sunspot cycle since we've been writing about it. Now, if you look at the title of this slide, C-spot curve, that's a euphemism. There in the States, there is a popular children's book to teach them how to read called Dick and Jane. The two characters are Dick and Jane. They have a cat named Puff and a dog named Spot. And one of the early sentences that I recall reading in some of their books was C-spot run. And the teacher would instruct students about what are the parts of that sentence and so on. Well, it predicting the sunspot cycle reminds me of that C-spot curve. It curves with peaks and troughs. And the writing about that and the predictions of those is basically a cottage industry in amateur radio, books, articles, and online forums, such as the popular QRZ.com. Now, in this writing in amateur radio, and to some degree in astrophysics, it follows this canonical dictum of a sine wave cycle of 11 years from peak to peak in the sunspot cycle. And this has been the case since Heinrich Schwabe made this inference and published it back in 1849. In amateur radio, there's a wide variation of technical sophistication, time series modeling and mathematical curve fitting techniques, such as Carl Luschel-Schwab in his book that CQ Magazine and its book publishing company has published recently, ranging from that to just putting a copy in Photoshop or GIMP or some other picture editing tool, taking the old one and placing it over a new period of time and calling it a rough estimate of solar cycle 25. And everyone sort of claims this is my projection and this is what shall be. A really important point, if you take nothing else away from my talk this evening, please take this. None of them, including the official models, have an explicit theory that drives the forecast model. Now, this makes them in time series literature, of which I'm a statistician. They're called a class of mere prediction models. They are not in another column of explanatory models. I've given some citations in the Radcom articles if you want to go look at them. Those are two very different things. None of our existing ones prior to the Macintosh team articulate a theory to drive that model. Important point just to acknowledge. Now, here's an example of Nathan W1YW on QRZ.com in February 2020. Everyone was getting excited. There are going to be these predictions coming out from NASA NOAA, and boy, let's get our antennas ready and let's get ready for a new solar cycle. And you can see here on the left, and Nathan was very honest about this. He said, here's the previous cycle. You are here where this vertical black line is. And then here's my prediction. It started off to look kind of like this. And here's what it looks like. It kind of looks like an orca whale coming up to eat something, but perhaps that's just me. And so Nathan quotes from some of the predictions. Consensus is that solar max will be between 23 and 25. Now we're in the very bottom of poor HF conditions. Perhaps in 2021, there'll be some improvement. Excellent will be rare. Don't plan on a 24-hour worldwide propagation on 10 meters in 2024. We might not have had 24 hours of worldwide 10-meter prop, but we've had a good 18 in 2022 already. So there'll be plenty of lousy HF prop days ahead. Here's a graph. It's a rough estimate and so on. This is not to put down anyone as you're not bright enough to understand this. It has nothing to do with how bright you are. What it has to do with is following an existing paradigm without a theory. Now, W1YW is a smart person. He's got a PhD either in mathematics or physics. I'm not sure which. And he claims patents on things like fractal antennas, a complex subject. So he's a bright person. It's just an example of when we ritualistically parrot an existing paradigm of sunspot prediction and we don't have a theory engaged in it. This is what happens. Now, let's look at what we tell ourselves in our own prestigious publication. This is our collective talk to one another about propagation and sunspots. In the ARL handbook in 2019, since the earliest days of systematic observation, our traditional measure has been based on a count of sunspots. In these hundreds of years, we've learned that the average number of spots goes up and down in cycles, very roughly approximating a sine wave. An 11-year sunspot cycle affects propagation conditions because there is a direct correlation between sunspot activity and ionization. Who is going to dispute that? We see that so routinely that I'm certainly not attacking that. I do want to point out something. Notice that there's nothing about, well, what causes that 11-year cycle? You're just taking that as given. Eric Nichols, propagation is an art form, and while we've been getting better at it over the past century, it's far from a hard science. We still can't predict when or how many sunspots may pop up at a given time. And we're still not sure where we are in the sunspot cycle. Now, that's in 2015. Top experts still can't agree on whether we're going to have the best or worst solar cycle in the history of ham radio or in the history of man. Wow, pretty strong statement. Now, on your side of the pond, Steve Nichols, a little more British in tone, a little more reserved, I would say. A number of factors have become obvious since the figures from the first records were available. The first is that cycles are by no means very regular. The average cycle length is measured in the time between two peaks is about 10.9 years. But notice what Steve says. It varies from just over 7 years to 17 years between peak to peak time. Wow, that's about 11 years, or certainly 10. And that is about the length of one entire sunspot cycle as we claim it to be here at 11 years. So they are by no means consistent and regular, are they? So the maximum sunspot activity numbers can vary from 49 to 200 with an average of just over 100. And the minimum can be anywhere between 0 and 12. So we've got this 11-year sunspot cycle that we sort of worship at as the Holy Grail. And yet, wow, there's a lot of anomalies there, and yet we still have faith in that. Now, Carl Luschel-Schwab, K9LA, says this. A third observation is that we appear to be headed for another long-term period of lower solar activity. Now, he published this on his website without a specific date, but it appeared there as we were getting ready for cycle 25. Although cycle 24 will do is still debated, what it will do, I believe that scientists will have a single consensus for cycle 25. It will be low, followed by several more low ones. Of course, in the history of the sun, this may not be a good predictor of future activity. Not only don't we fully understand the solar cycle process, we only have a couple of 100 years of data for a process that has likely been going on for thousands or millions of years. And that's a small sample size indeed. Okay, let's reflect on what my friend Carl Luschel-Schwab is saying here. The implication is clear. If we just had more data, if we had not a couple of 100 years of data, but how about a couple of 1,000 years of data? Or maybe 1,000,000 years of data. If we just had more data, we could do a lot of fancy modeling and we could just come up with that better model and we could predict sunspot cycles and we would kind of know what's going on. Now, giving a little bit of literary license here, and I've communicated with Carl, and I'm just trying to make a point here that the argument is we have something in place, it exists, and if we just had more data, we could figure it out. I'll challenge that in a moment. All leading amateur propagation experts make use of this. Now, this has been accepted canon for a century now. But as Eric Nichols said, top experts cannot identify the predicted peak or trough or the timing. So the question is this. The devotion to the theoretically unexplained 11-year sine wave function as a paradigm in the face of all these anomalies is, quite honestly, puzzling. Why is that? Well, let's look at how science works. If we don't have a theory, and as Carl said, we just had more data, we could figure it out, the thing that we're studying. The absence of theory to tell us what causes sunspots and the steadfast insistence that sunspots are what the observed counts are. Have you ever heard someone talk about an IQ test or an intelligence test, and someone says, what is intelligence? Oh, it's what intelligence tests measure. Well, that is what we call in the philosophy of science teleology, that something is what the measurements are, or that the purpose of sunspots is its cause. Immanuel Kant in 1790, Stuart Nagel later in 2012, Barrow and Tipler in their review in the mid-'80s, all the philosophers of science caution us against doing that. It is theoretically confusing. So this teleological bent by the current paradigm does have some practical utility, because it helps explain what we might call spillover effects from a core science like solar physics to a consumer of that science like amateur radio. Folks, we're just following along. We're just following along what the solar physicists tell us. I don't blame Carl Lewis Schwab or any of the others. We're just following along. We're amateur operators. They're solar physicists. But it begins in solar physics itself. And I want to focus on that for just a second. Now, here is a video, and I hope that I shared my audio. Let me share sound. Okay. David, if you don't hear this, just pop back and we'll get that working. I just shared my audio.
At Kitt Peak Observatory in Arizona, solar astronomer Matt Penn studies this solar surface to discover how photons of light get trapped.
There's a bunch of theories today, but hopefully we'll get some data.
Using the McNath-Pierce telescope, he focuses the sun's light to scan the photosphere in detail.
So what we've got are a few small sunspots on the disk of the sun. We've got two sunspots, two large ones. They're heading off to the edge of the sun, to the limb of the sun. But they're all accompanied by smaller sunspots, groups of smaller ones following them.
Sunspots mark areas where light is trapped.
So a sunspot forms a dark spot by removing energy from that part of the sun. It's blocking the convective flows that transport the heat and the light from inside the sun to space. And so what we see then is a cooler region that appears dark to us.
A powerful force stops our photon dead in its tracks, preventing its light and energy from leaving the sun's surface. That force is magnetism. Sunspots take shape where intense magnetism from deep inside the sun blasts up through the photosphere.
The magnetic fields are so strong that it actually stops the convective motion of hot inner material from flowing to the surface. So you actually get what looks like a cool spot on the surface of the sun.
They can be huge, the largest over 10 times the size of Earth.
So here's another one. So magnetism, that's a key point that was made in that video. I want to show you that this has no sound to it, but I want you to watch this part of the sun when we have a coronal ejection of a filament, and watch what happens because of magnetism. Right here. Boom. Nope, you're not getting away. You're going to come right back. And as we watch that again, you can see that this mass of magnetized plasma has a really strong effect. Magnetism at work. Now, I want to show you another one. This was created for another purpose by Dr. Alex Parker, and I ran across it on Twitter. This is a teapot, a magnetic tempest in a teapot in 1 second. It's got mica powder, and underneath this is a set of magnets that's just rotating. Now, I'm not trying to tell you this is how the sun operates, but I want to give you a visual illustration of what that looks like, because what we're going to talk about with the Macintosh team theory, this metaphor in your mind might be very useful for how there are streams and almost tubes that magnetic material that is circulated. I'll play it one more time. You can see these things go round and round. Now, the sun may or may not go round and round. I have no real knowledge of that. But I want you just to get this in your mind, because as we talk about the Macintosh theory, this will help us think about those phenomena that they're talking about. So, like electricity, magnetism has opposing poles. Now, early in amateur radio, we kind of did more with magnets than we do today. Today, we tend to think about electricity. And the sun, especially internally, is thought to be a dynamo, like that little teapot suggested, magnetic forces. Now, I want to show you some actual neodymium magnets. And, David, I hope I'm close enough to the camera. Now, these are just magnets I bought on Amazon.
Actually, if you could just bear with us a moment, Frank, we're going to give a close-up of your picture. There we are, so that everybody at home can see.
All right. Thank you. And thank you for assistance.
That's okay. One other tip, though. You need to hold that, because you've got a virtual background on, you do need to hold them in front of your face at all time. Otherwise, they'll disappear with the zoom. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I've got two little round magnets I bought on Amazon. I use them to mount equipment into metal IT racks, and I'll epoxy this to the bottom of something, and it's in place. Now, notice that these two discs, I'm not a big muscle-bound guy, but I've got reasonable strength, and I can't put these together. I just physically can't quite get them a touch. If I turn one sideways, no problem. Why is that? They have magnetic poles, just like electricity. I know many of you already know this and may know more about it than I do. I just wanted to illustrate this very fundamental principle that you can hold in your hands and think about what helps shape or cause sunspots in some of their behaviors, because that's integral to the Macintosh theory. Okay, I'll go back to my slide set. The Paul Charbonneau dynamo models of the solar cycle. It's an open source published by my former employer, Springer, in Living Reviews in Solar Physics. Paul is from Canada, and it's an excellent article that will help you maybe read a little more about dynamo models and the predominant theory about how the sun actually works. So magnetism is important. You remember the famous movie The Graduate back in the 60s with the American actor Dustin Hoffman? He was at a party, and someone came up to him and gave him career advice. And that was, for you movie fans, plastics. Well, if this were a remake of The Graduate, it would be magnets and magnetism. So how did sunspot behavior become a cycle? How did that happen? And it's kind of interesting to know, because it shows you the longevity that some simple ideas in science can have. And I call it the Schwabe inductive inference. Now, Galileo recorded some sunspots, I'm told, and perhaps some other people around the world, but it's really credited to Heinrich Schwabe, born in 1789, passed away in 1875. He's the first one to compile daily sunspots and offer up the sine wave characterization of them. Now, he was very dedicated. In one of my readings, and I've read a lot about him, And you'll find that there are, in science, as I've studied it, there are these little things that happen, these little observations. We all think of Newton with the apple falling on his head, as it's written. Schwabe began to just record these, and he was very interested. In amateur radio, we used to have log books. Many of us still do. In the States, we're not required to anymore. But those of us who do DX or contests or want to keep up with such matters, we tend to keep a logbook. Well, so did he. And he recorded these activities. And to show how dedicated he was, in one of his entries for a given day, he noted that the wall clock had stopped. And oh, by the way, his wife passed away at 9 p.m. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing to trivialize that. But it just shows you how dedicated that he was. In every year beginning in 1826, if it was a clear day, he would scan the sun and record its spots. And after 17 years, and I want to impress upon you, would you do something without any particular payoff to it or with a goal in mind for 17 years? Just continue to do it every day. He later began to suspect a regular variation. Took him 17 years. And he noticed the regular variation in the number of sunspot cycles over a 10-year cycle, not 11, 10 years. He published it in a little paper called Solar Observations during 1843. It was ignored. Very few people looked at it. There's a reason. There was no paradigm at the time to put it in a larger context of what it might mean for us. However, this periodicity of sunspots is now fully recognized, and Schwabe is thus due the credit to one of the most important discoveries in all of astronomy. Now, here on the left, you'll see an excerpt from some of his work, and he recorded, like 1826, there were 22 days, no sunspots. There were only 277 observation days because of clouds. And he would kind of group them in clusters. And on the right, this is an actual scan of a sketch that Schwabe used to identify and number sunspots. Some would be there. Oh, it emerged. Okay, it's there. Well, maybe it's moved, but it's still there, and so on. So he gave a sketch to this. And there have been some people who have compiled all this work, and it's a very eloquent record of this. Now, there are problems. The tilt from his location in Dessau, Germany, the tilt to the sun, well, you may have to count that. You may not see certain things. And frankly, like most of us, myself certainly first in line, his handwriting was not the best. And some dots, which he used here, maybe here, it had confusing meanings that was not really all that consistent. But he said, I willingly concur in the opinion that this period may itself be characterized by variability. But he had this declaration. Now, David Hathaway, who was a NASA scientist and was in Huntsville, Alabama, to my east, compiled some of these data and produced this little histogram. And you can begin to see how it rises and falls. It rises and falls. It's really important to understand this was an inductive as compared to a deductive inference. An inductive inference has no formal theory about it. It is simply something like Newton. The apple fell, hit me in the noggin. Why? These sunspots go up and down. Why? He didn't predict it ahead of time and then collect data and test this. We'll come back to this in a moment. Now, not many people really looked at Schwabe's work except for the Swiss astronomer Rudolf Wolf. And Wolf was so impressed that if you think Schwabe was committed, Wolf spent more than 40 years going through the records of astronomical observatories, and he compiled the first history of sunspots back as far as 1745. He looked at this broader period of data, and he says, Schwabe was a little off here. Yes, it is accurate for the years he made the observations. They seem to be 10 years from peak to peak. But if you look at it over a longer time slice, as we statisticians like to say, outside the scope of Schwabe's data, it's more like 11. And so he later corrected this short slice of data by Schwabe, and this is where the 11-year cycle comes into being. Well, let's take just a brief moment and let's take stock on what we can see and what kind of inferences we can make. On the left is this record of sunspot cycles back to about 1750. And if you look at them, you can kind of say, okay, they do follow a sine wave. Me and my oscilloscope concur. It's sine wave. There we go. But it is a little different. The regular movement up to a peak and then back down, yes, that's universal. But the peaks are not consistent. Some are higher than others. The cycles don't wholly replicate the others. Down here with the smooth monthly values, you can see what the troughs look like. And notice how narrow some of these troughs are in comparison to, say, these others. Wow, that's a big trough. That stayed in the doldrums for a good while if you were an amateur radio operator, of which there were none then. So irregular gaps between one sine wave cycle and the subsequent one, they also vary. So it leads to the question, does it make sense to you that sunspot cycles are only caused by previous behavior? Wouldn't we expect if the previous behavior, even if it's 2 or 3 cycles behind, that it would predict the current one? And you can just see by visual observation, well, gosh, it really doesn't seem to be that way going back in the record of time that we have. Now, if my friend Carl Schwab would have it, according to his argument, if we stretch this on back for millennia, then we just had enough data. It begs the question of, would any of those data in the past be fundamentally different in these characteristics than we have today? We can't say yes or no, but there's nothing that would suggest that that might be the case. But anyway, does it make sense that they cause themselves? Personally, I don't think so, and I don't think that in the philosophy of science it lends itself to saying that this is a phenomenon in and of itself, that it causes itself. So, how do we get these official sunspot predictions? Well, the bad news is that there's only a translucent view at best by the public into how the scientific sausage is made. Now, in the depths of the last 3 solar minima, the last 3 solar cycles, NASA and NOAA in the U.S. have convened panels, international in scope, of experts in solar physics, time series modeling, and other related areas to assess and forecast the next cycle, the upcoming maximum of solar activity. Now, this may be surprising to some of you. It was when I met Scott McIntosh and began to learn about how things work. The last NASA NOAA panel met on the floor beneath his office in Colorado. So he knows of what he speaks here. They don't give you any documentation of how they make the prediction. I'm going to repeat that. They don't tell you how they come up with them. Now, that is very different from other scientific reports. It's a standard canon of science to disclose your methods so others can attempt to replicate them. And as the U.S. writer Eric Nichols says, good science is subject to peer review. I certainly would agree, being one myself. So the scientific panel releases data points that represent their forecast, but not the detailed methods used in creating the numbers. So this is in Radcom, and the citation by Upton et al. Is the source. What they do tell you is they have models and predictions that different scientists and others just send into them. In fact, they call, if you've got a model, send it to us. And look at what happens. Here's the distribution. Now, I asked for better graphics from Upton. This was her PowerPoint. Never heard from her. Multiple requests, never heard. Mum's your word. They are radio silent. Now they've got 2 versions of sunspots, and that guy Wolf we talked about, he did a modification to really better count sunspots, and that's been continued over the years. So there's a version 1 of the sunspot number and a version 2. But as you can see it, these different models give you different predictions. Using version 1 data, the average peak is about 112, 113 over the first 24 sunspot cycles. The average of all predictions for this go-around is 86, fairly weak. Version 2, not terribly different. The average of all predictions is about 120. They had about 61 models, and here's how they're distributed. And we don't have any details about what those meant. We also don't have any details about how they used these and what they did to come up with their own prediction. Now, I've been on panels. I've been on the U.S. Department of Agriculture's panel on agricultural statistics. I've been on NSF panels. I've worked with National Institutes of Health and others. So I've kind of been in the room on some of these things. Their challenge is to use state-of-the-art knowledge to develop a consensus estimate. That is what the group thinks at the time. And they're only together for, some relatively short period of time. They don't have an explicit model. What's the sunspot maximum going to be? How high is it going to be? And when is it going to transition from one to the other? When is cycle 25 going to arrive? Now, in fairness, these panels have not had a great deal of success in estimating the timing or the strength. And some of them admit that. They construct official forecasts through a democratic vote of the panel members. How many say aye for this one? That sort of thing. Now, there is a window into the inner workings from the magazine author Sarah Scholes in Science Magazine. She published a very eloquent essay. It's cited in Radcom. If anybody can't get a hold of it, pop me an email. I'm good on QRZ, K4FMH, and I'll send you a PDF of it. A couple of the panelists, Rachel Howell, the University of Birmingham in the UK, she looks at statistical models, and she said, well, there's not much physics involved in the model. And there's not much statistical sophistication either. So the chair of the panel, Dr. Bisecker, conceded the point. We really haven't found a model that seems to work, and we've been doing it for hundreds of years. And yet, when the vote came, he reversed course and said a consensus among experts can often be better prediction of the future state of a system than can this set of individual predictions. So we don't know how the sausage is made. It's a democratic vote. There are legitimate methods to average forecast models. We don't know what they did. Think about hurricane season. In Europe, there's a group of meteorologists that have the European model, and they publish that. And there are a bunch of little squiggly lines for if A occurs, the red line's going to be it. If B occurs, the blue line will be it. And over here in the U.S., there's the U.S. model. And very often, meteorologists who are on television particularly will put these together. And what do they call them? They call them these spaghetti models because there's all these different lines that are done. There are ways to put them together. From meteorologists with hurricanes, they don't work very well either. There are situations where professional judgment is important, such as the National Bureau of Economic Research here in the U.S. There's no official measurement of a recession. It's a judgment by experts. On your side of the pond, there are similar types of judgments. When I served on the Secretary of Agriculture's advisory board, the thing that we did was we arbitrarily but democratically voted what is a farm? How much in sales of agricultural products do you have to have in a year to be classified as a farm? There is a role for professional judgment, and that's what they use here. Now, in my opinion, I think part of an issue that we amateur radio operators have is we see it's the NASA NOAA panel. NASA put a man on the moon. They know what they're doing. NOAA, they track all the hurricanes. They must have the supercomputer at work doing the forecast. And as I've told you, no. Now, I worked for NASA during the late 90s at Stennis Space Center. I coordinated a $60 million program on commercial remote sensing. I was a badged official. I'm a certified NOAA storm spotter, as many hams are. Now, both NASA and NOAA do have major supercomputing capabilities. I've placed a picture over here on the right side of the screen. This is the Pleiades supercomputer built by Silicon Graphics. It's at NASA Ames Research Center in Mountain View, California. Wow, what an impressive one. NOAA has tripled its supercomputing capacity, a 12 petaflop General Dynamics system, $500 million. I've worked with supercomputers, and I've been in the room. And they do have incredible capability. They just don't use it on propagation forecast. And I think that's the take-home thing for us hams to remember. It's important to know it's a democratic vote by multidisciplinary experts, not the results of any explicit theory driving empirical model to generate numerical forecast. Well, how unusual is this? It's a little unusual to not disclose your methods for sure, but we have two types of predictions, or two groups of predictions, and it forces us to think about how does science work, basically, and how does it change? And the idea of a scientific paradigm is what we use to examine that. A paradigm is the broadest unit of consensus about a scientific area of knowledge. How do they operate, and what leads them to change? Well, the reason that we follow along this holy grail of the 11-year sine wave is really predicated on how paradigms work. Thomas Kuhn, who was a physicist, defined a paradigm in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. I used to use that as one of the textbooks in my courses when I was still a professor. And I have a figure where I've taken his idea of how science evolves, a given paradigm. How does it move? How does it change? And I've put it in the context of sunspot cycle. A lot of words. I'll try to go through them, fairly quickly, and I'll also make my slides available to NARC if you wish to share them. When Schwabe was making a log of his observations, and he made this inference of a 10-year cycle, it reflected pre-science. There was a lack of a broad unit of consensus in terms of theory about what that was. He was a little like Newton and the apple. He just was making some observations, and he did it very well for the time with pen and paper. When we have a set of beliefs about a paradigm, we tend to then have kind of an official start to what Kuhn called normal science. And the scientific community, okay, they've got these ideas. They know what the world is like with regard to this phenomenon. You see it in the news media. We interview experts. Well, they are experts in a paradigm. The paradigm tells scientists what to look at, what to see, and largely what to conclude in the normal science state. This is commonly called puzzle solving. And if you want to know why many, many scientists around the globe work such long hours, often for low pay in relative terms in comparison to the corporate world, it's what drives scientists on, the curiosity to figure out that next puzzle, that next part of the paradigm. So predicting a sunspot cycle based solely upon past cycle behavior as an 11-year period, that's part of the puzzle solving. Keep on keeping on. And yet, as Eric Nichols pointed out, there are these anomalies that occur. Top experts can't still agree on, is it going to be high or is it going to be low? And when is it going to concur? So we've got a paradigm, yet it doesn't work very well. And we have these anomalies that occur, yet we still have faith in the paradigm. Now, if enough of these anomalies occur, we have what are called model drift. We have people going, wow, I'm still a believer here, but there's just enough that's not working here. I'm going to pipe down. I'm not going to be talking too much about it here. At this point in 2012, the Macintosh team submitted to Science magazine their paper that has most of the ideas that they are now publishing at least a decade later. It was flatly rejected by Science magazine. Why is that? That's because the existing scientists who have an investment in the current state of knowledge, they engage in what's called boundary maintenance. I get a paper to review. I read it. It's fundamentally new. I call up my friend who does similar work. Have you seen that Macintosh paper I've just reviewed? Oh, yes. I went to a conference. We can't let that get published. It might affect our ability to get grant money to fund our labs. Yes, it happens. Wish it didn't. Yes, it happens. Been there, been involved with that. Run panels in Washington, had people on those review panels that wanted to reject the proposal because they were protecting their own paradigm and their own scientific interest. So when anomalies get sufficient attention by other scientists who get outside the paradigm, there can be a crisis, a model crisis in that area of science where it's like a little bit of a boxing match. We got something different and we're coming at you. So this maintenance is a key thing. Here's what happened then. When Macintosh team released their forecast, they gave a theory. Not only did they give a theory, they put their data out, their model data out, and there is an independent website where you can track the monthly sunspots versus what was predicted by the NASA NOAA team and by the Macintosh team. That first slide that showed you those data points is from that website, and I'll come back to it. So here you have model competition. The competing paradigm offers the model that has these characteristics. It's more consistent with the instrumental observations at the core of the science. Now let's see, what's the core of the science on amateur radio operators and solar physicists on looking at propagation? It's sunspot cycles. So are their predictions closer to the actual sunspot observations? And if it explains key phenomena more accurately and with greater theoretical understanding, now you have a theory that explains why sunspots occur. Unlike the ARL handbook that I pointed out, there was no explanation of what caused them. There was just the pounding of the desk that they have a direct correlation with propagation. So pay no attention to the man behind the curtain in one of Shakespeare's plays. So here we are. I think this is where we are. We're between model competition and model revolution. The revolution occurs when the shift in adherence from the old paradigm to the new one occurs not in some slow, chin scratching, this looks like it could be better. No. It is like people jumping into life rafts off of the Titanic, like rats leaving a sinking ship. It's very revolutionary and can be very quick. Thank you for bearing with me. This is a key part of understanding what's going on with these two paradigms. So what is this new paradigm? Some theory to explain characterizations of the sunspot cycle. Now, I've got two pictures here on the screen of the sun. The one on the left, no, that is not that 1970 shag carpet that you had in an apartment when you were at the university and danced on. It looks like it, but it is not. It is the closest picture to date from a probe to the sun. You see all these little things that look like the stuff in that blue teapot that I showed the little video of, that you've got the plasma going around and around. Here is a model of the sun with a depiction of what is thought to be many of the magnetic lines that are crossing the sun. Now, here was the thing that's a little bit like Newton and the apple and Schwabe in the inductive inference of the cycle, is that Macintosh got to thinking more seriously about, well, what causes the sunspot? And recognizing the dominance of the magnetic aspects of the sun as the dynamo of action. Now, one of his mentors, a scientist named Gurman, said, you might look at the UV bright points as our measurements of some of these things going on. Interesting recommendation. Now, Gurman suggested that Macintosh identify and track these bright points, these small, you see them here on the left, and more accentuate on the right, ubiquitous features in the solar corona called EUV bright point. You might find something interesting. Wow, he may have never thought that what would happen in the last 20 years, 2002, that Scott and his team would bring to bear, these EUV bright points, key markers of some of the changes in the sun. Now, this is the very latest, as of last week, the daily EUV bright point density put into some graphics. This is over time, and on this left-hand column, these are the latitude in degrees on the sun. 0 is the equator, and as we move up to about 55 degrees or about 60, up or down, those are key boundaries for these EUV daily bright point densities. Now imagine daily 96, 20, 23, daily 365 times 15 years. Lots of data, lots of work. And so these are three different graphs of those that Scott sent me. You can begin to see the migration of these bright points toward the equator. And look here, you see how these things fit together? These are typically called butterfly wings. You see how something happens here, and then boom, there's another set of these. These go out of existence, these continue on. And you begin to see that, and the Macintosh team began to see this happens regularly. This is not a fluke. This continues to happen over and over again, at least as far as we can pull data back. So the new observational paradigm is to do the following: to illustrate the production, that is terminology to say causality, to illustrate the cause of the approximate 11-year sunspot cycle. They argue that because of the effect of magnetism here, the 22-year magnetic cycle subsumes two 11-year cycles. So the 11-year cycles that we've been jumping up and down about for decades is really influenced by the 22-year cycle that was identified by George Ellery Hale. We'll see him in a slide here in a second. The key is that magnetic flux associated with deep-rooted magnetic flux tubes. Go back to the magnetic tempest in a teapot. I showed you that because you saw how those tubes looked like they occurred in that. Well, I use that as a metaphor to think about what they're saying. These deep-rooted magnetic flux tubes, they emerge in a coherent fashion. Go back to the teapot. They didn't just appear for a second and then change and go in another direction, did they? No, they were fairly stable over time in that little blue mica powdered teapot. This is metaphorically somewhat similar to what Macintosh is saying. They go toward the equator. Now, this could not be seen by the existing paradigm, the NOAA-NASA paradigm. They couldn't see because the paradigm tells them what to see and what not to see. And this boundary maintenance was kind of a devastating start. We'll look at how that's changed. I want to make one passing note. In doing my reading for this, in the 1940 ARRL handbook on page 319, I made this note. This is a quote, an actual screenshot of that book. The ionization also is influenced by cyclic changes in the condition of the sun itself, so that similar variations follow the 27-day and 11 or 22-year sunspot activity cycle. A few years later, that went away. I asked Ward Silver, who is a consulting editor to ARRL in producing the handbook. He wasn't sure, but as we get to the George Hale slide, you'll see when he published his work, it was probably the case that whoever was editing the handbook then had read some of Hale's work and said, it could be 22 years. We don't know. I mentioned that in passing. So Hale developed this idea that here's the sunspot cycle that we all know and love if it's high and hate if it's low. Here is the Hale magnetic cycle, and you can see that those bright points have different poles, just as I showed you with the magnets before. Can do it here, can't do it here because of their magnetic poles, just like electricity. And you see how this one flipped up, this one flips down. So they flip their polarity. Think of the blue teapot. What would that do to the magnetic plasma? Surely does something, but it does it very regularly and very routinely for well over 100 years. So this is their argument that the magnetic 22-year cycle, the Hale magnetocycle, is important. The interaction between these overlapping bands I just showed you of red and blue are really important. And it must occur, a hypothesis, through the magnetic flux, through deep-rooted magnetic flux tubes in the sun. How do they get from higher latitudes down to low latitudes and then boom, back up? Well, it must be inside. And so this polar convective recycling time, if you remember the little video I showed you from Kitt Peak Observatory, he talked about this convective recycling time. That's kind of standard dynamo theory if you go read David Hathaway's chapter. So given that these polar cells operate on a observable time scale, they've got one function of being clocked that sort of synchronized that system. Just as we looked at the blue teapot as the magnets under it went round and around on a consistent basis, then those little flux tubes did too. So flux emerges in a coherent fashion several years before sunspots appear on precisely the same equatorward trajectory. I'm going to show you a little video of that in just 1 second. So when events make the magnetocycle jump from the equator back up to higher latitudes, particularly around 55 degrees, Scott and his team, who obviously love Arnold Schwarzenegger and the Terminator movies, call them the Terminator events. They are the new sunspot cycle from one Terminator to another Terminator, not from minimum and maximum in the 11-year cycle. We'll talk about why in a moment. They are the cardinal marker. And this definition is imprecise for good reason. If you watch the Olympics or track and field, you know where you have a group of runners that are in a race and they have a baton, and one is running toward the next one to hand off the baton, does that one who's going to get the baton, does that person just stand still and wait till they get the baton before they start running? No. They start running ahead of time. In fact, they practice this a lot. They start running ahead of time. So that baton gets handed off and the baton itself never stops. Well, you can think about that in a way that the end of one cycle is still there while the roots or beginning of the next cycle are also in play and they overlap. That's why the peak and the trough no longer really capture what McIntosh and his team thinks really are going on. And here's the key. Here's the key ingredient. As my friend Martin Butler says on our punchline in our podcast for the feature, it's what you've all been waiting for. The length of time between one terminator and the next determines how high the next sunspot cycle is going to be. The distance in time between the terminator for the previous cycle and terminator for this cycle, that distance determines the height of the next sunspot cycle. We're going to look at that. So the magnetic cycles overlap and interact. They got regular starts. They migrate to the equator in a varying period of time. That's not the same. Their interactions are not always the same. But that interaction shapes the evolution of sunspot cycle, including the amplitude. And measuring the separation of the terminators gives us a proxy of the Hale cycle overlap, just like the two runners that are going to hand off the baton from one cycle to another. Briefly, this is George Ellery Hale. He was at the Wilson Observatory near Los Angeles. If you notice the instrument he's using, it's not terribly different than the one you saw at Kitt Peak that NASA has. There's a reason. Now, which I'll tell you in 1 second. He connected the northern and southern hemisphere magnetic bands having that opposite polarization. He theorized that they were in a vortex structure and they cancel opposing polar forces. This is in 1908. They flipped polarization around the minimum observed sunspot cycle, only to reverse again. His stuff is very similar to what's at Kitt Peak because Los Angeles developed too much smog and there were days that they couldn't get good pictures, so they moved from Wilson Observatory near Los Angeles to Kitt Peak Observatory in Arizona. That's part of why you see the same thing. If you ever get a chance to read this article, I love reading historical science. They lay it all out there. They're not doing any marketing for their next grant. They just tell you what they found. So here's a depiction of the Hale cycle. As you see, this is one element of polarization. Here's another. You see the two track runners as they overlap to hand off the baton, and you see how this flips. Boom. The blue goes from south to north, and the red goes from north to south. And these are depictions of these polar flux tubes as things move down to the equator. Now, here's a more mathematically elegant model of what might be the case with these torsion tubes that you saw in that blue teapot that I got to illustrate the torsional rotation. So here's the deal. These dashed lines are terminators. So here's our favorite index, our solar flux index. The house has been on fire with the SFI the last week or so. So here you go. Here's our cycle going up and down with SFI. Here are our sunspots for the Earth, and red and blue are for different hemispheres. And note that they aren't always the same. And this is why sometimes we get double peaked peak periods. Now, here's the sunspot distribution here by latitude. And notice how these overlap and then suddenly change. So what they're saying, you see, this is the end of the previous cycle. And then it begins, you see this overlap, this new one has not begun yet, and it goes to the end of the red one. The distance from here to here is the distance between the terminator events, which will shape how high the next cycle is going to be. And we're going to see this at termination right here and right here. There's a lot of stuff going on. It's a little bit like that tempest in a teapot. There's this tsunami of activity, of magnetic activity. So let's look at a simulation of that. But McIntosh's colleague, Dick Potty, created this animation. So we've got a lot of stuff going on at the equator. Then boom, going to watch it again. You've got the overlap. You remember not Patrick McGowan, but the Star Trek sci-fi one where you had the Scottish engineer in charge of the Enterprise. He would tell Captain Kirk, "I just can't do it, Captain. I just can't do it." Well, you can see at the equator here, I just can't hold it. I just can't hold it. And so suddenly, boom, it pops up in a new cycle at about 55 degrees. And this can happen within a month, a solar month of 27 days of rotation. So boom, there's an illustration, not real, but a simulated animation of what it might be like. All right, now let's put this all together. As you see this going on here, you'll see our favorite friend, the sunspot number. Black is for the Earth, red and blue for different hemispheres. And then you'll see the magnetic cycle. Look at how they work together. As it goes down at the bottom, then boom, appears back up. Every time it appears up here when there's a peak. Every time you see the UV bright point, you see it happen again. Boom, it occurs down at the trough. Boom, it appears back at the 55 degrees. So this is an animation of these flux polarity choking the sunspots off, and then that tsunami of them fluctuating back up to 55 degrees latitude. That's the theory. You don't get that from the NASA NOAA panel. You do get it from the McIntosh team. Okay. And now here they're trying to flesh this out because their critics say, yeah, but you haven't measured the magnetic field or cycle. Okay. So they're going, these are just some graphs in progress to use the best data that they have. I think they got a hold of a group in Japan that was measuring certain things, or on the West Coast, I forget. But they're pulling together, in the truest spirit of science, from my experience, all the data that can reject or confirm some of their ideas. Here is some of the latest bright points in trying to get as granular. You can tell he loves the Terminator stuff. Finer and finer points, and using a new way to visualize it, the Hubmiller diagrams, where you've got a polar diagram so you can see what's where over time as they evolve some of this. Just got this week. I guess they call Batman instead of the Terminator. You can see how these tend to fluctuate, getting better and more granular data to look at over time and by longitude to see where these things are on the sun from the best probe data that we have. And I just got these last week from Scott. Now, so what shapes the sunspot amplitude? Back when their projections originally came out and they went everywhere, they said, okay, NASA NOAA has released their prediction. Okay. Here are our predictions based on our theory. And if the current cycle's terminator is at a certain date, this date, they picked one they thought it would be. If it's at this date, then here's what the distance between the two terminators would suggest. So this delta is again, the terminator for one cycle, the terminator for the end of that cycle, and then that period of time, look at what happens. And this is the number of the solar cycle. The one that we finished in 24, there were about 13 years between the terminator, okay? So their little simple regression model would predict that it would be about right here. Now notice this is the pink diagram for the current cycle 25 NASA NOAA. Notice how our friend Nathan, without using any theory, just copying the old one and placing it over the new one. Hey, that's pretty much on par with 24, but it just hasn't been working out. So if the terminator was going to end, that they thought it was, a little over 9 years, and cycle 25 would be up here around 250 peak number of sunspots. Cycle 3, cycle 19. Think for yourself. Some of you, now I just turned 70, so some of you who are clearly in what we call in the States the baby boomer generation after World War II, think about that famous sunspot cycle where 10 meters was open worldwide, and it didn't take much, and you could just do anything you wanted to do with very little equipment. Wow. And so guess what? It didn't end the way that they thought it would. So it wasn't a failure of their model. They revised their predictions after they observed when the terminator really occurred. They were a little too optimistic. So that was actually within the model. So instead of being here, it turned into being almost an 11-year distance between the terminator. And so their revised predictions was down here a little under 200, Still much higher than the NASA NOAA panel. So the key punchline from the Macintosh theory is that the difference between the terminators will predict the next sunspot. Well, if you look at your television and you look at weather forecasters, you'll see today there's all kinds of nice graphics where they have an emulation, that deep red is going to be more intense thunderstorms. Well, back when I was a child, I'm 70, let's just say 50, 55 years ago, they had these weird, odd things they would put on a map of the TV coverage area and tell you what that meant. That's called a metaphor in data visualization. And so we need a different metaphor than the 11-year sine wave, because peak to trough doesn't tell you as much about the sunspot cycle anymore under this new paradigm. So Bob Lehman has taken the lead and developed the sun clock. And you can see the minimum and the maximum of the number of sunspots, the terminator from terminator to terminator, and plotting out what's going on. I'll wager that next solar cycle after 25, but for 26, some version of this will be how we in our mind's eye will think about sunspot behavior. So these were the two sets of predictions. You'll see that NASA NOAA was smaller and theirs was higher, and it's tracking along fairly nicely. In the RADCOM articles, we included for the first time their solar flux index based upon an analysis of the relationship between sunspot number and the solar flux index. And you can see that the SFI has kind of tracked underneath, that is less than for each average month than what they predicted. But those of you who've been keeping up, boys and girls, know that we have hit over 200. It's not in the graph because remember, when you smooth things, you take some ahead of time and some behind time, and you put them together in various mathematical ways. It can elude you. It can mask as much as it reveals if you don't understand that that's what they're doing. So the next time this is out here, this observation is going to be way over what they had initially predicted. So this paper is now out in Timing Terminators Forecasting the Onset. They got a new method here, and it improves on the use of these complex bright points, although those are the fundamentals in their team. So let's compare the two. Here is the same graph that I showed you to begin with, but I illustrate a couple of things. In blue, NASA NOAA. In red, Macintosh. In black, here's what we observe. Now, which one would you be willing to go with? We had a couple of months where it kind of jumped back into the error prediction zone for NASA NOAA, but it recovered. It did that before. So do you have more faith in the traditional ones or the new ones? And that's where the heart of the paradigm change occurs. Are we on the cusp of a scientific revolution in sunspot models? Scientific philosophy that teleology doesn't explain something. Something is what the measurements are. New peer-reviewed theory construction by McIntosh's team and empirical models. Well, that suggests we might be. Now, about a century ago, there was the headline of the Times of London. And the reason that they covered that is in 1919, there was a solar eclipse, and Albert Einstein, that young whippersnapper, telling Newton that he just might be wrong. How dare this guy, this patent clerk from Switzerland at the time. His general theory of relativity had a sub-theorem called the principle of equivalence. And he postulated back in 1911 that light bending would be a consequence. Well, they said, look, there are some solar eclipses, and there's one coming up in a few years, where we could collect plates of photographs, and we could compare those plates if we had more than one location in the right place on the globe. If we could just get that, then I'm either right or Newton's right. And we can get those plates and find out. And so the Royal Society of Great Britain, the Royal Astronomical Society, led by the prominent expeditioners Eddington, Dyson, and Davidson, they went to the tropics of Brazil and the island of Principe to take pictures. And the literate world waited. Well, this is the headline, Revolution in Science, New Theory of the Universe, Newtonian Ideas Overthrown. And as I put in our Redcom paper, who now reads Newton for science rather than history? So I use this to really point out that this is an exciting time in science. And it's like it was a century ago. The current paradigm is in a crisis state. Which one's going to be right? And should this divergence occur throughout cycle 25, will the NASA NOAA panel change what they do? Will they tell us what they do? Should this play out over the next few years in this way? Will we be on the cusp of a scientific revolution in our understanding and forecast of the sunspot cycle? Now, what's really nice, unlike a century ago where the literate world waited, when are they coming back? You can go to this website and helioforecast.space/solar cycle. And every month, Chris Mostel puts up the new data. So you too can follow along, kids, and see who's going to be right as this solar cycle plays out. I'm sorry it's taken so long and it was nuanced and there's lots of details, but sometimes there's lots of details to try to understand something in a more sophisticated way. So I'll turn it back to you, David and Tammy.
Well, many thanks, Frank. Plenty there to think about, I think. And I happen to know that a few of the people you've mentioned as well are watching on one of the platforms. So I'm sure they might have some comments and questions or things for you as well.
Well, David, I would totally agree with Steve Nichols that that was a bit of a controversy, to use your local pronunciation. I agree with him. I think in another year it'll be less controversial, but we'll see.
We'll see, as you say. You've put you've explained it very well there. So please, at home now, if you haven't already done so and you want to make any comments, or have you got any questions for Frank or observations, excuse me, then please do so. We have had a couple of questions. Firstly, from Tom Miller. Is another Carrington event predicted soon? There seems to be a fatalistic reaction from world leaders suggesting Armageddon.
I know of none that have been predicted. Certainly none by the Macintosh team. Now, let me say, I read the same thing. I began my career as a news reporter in radio news, and I've worked with the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and so on. And I've still had investigative reporter credentials. So I've been in that world. Their world is a clock ticking on getting people to read their stuff and using good journalistic methods. And if it bleeds, it leads, as we say in the States. So disasters get your attention, right? So another Carrington event, particularly in a day where you can create a Carrington-like event with a bomb that is an electromagnetic pulse, that gets the public's attention. So I know of no predictions that there will be another Carrington event. But let me also say, many astrophysicists believe that there were actually 2 major sunspots that occurred at that time, not just one. And if you think about the telegrapher's lines that had induced in them electric current, because as we know, that happens with that, we now have a lot more in the way of electric lines, do we not? We got bigger antenna to catch those. So it might take less than what it took then for something similar to occur. So I know of no forecast of a Carrington event. I think there's just some general fear, this could happen. It might.
Okay, thanks, Frank. Steve Nichols, G0KY, he says, thanks for the name check. That's all he said. So,
listen, I'm going to tip my hat to you, Steve. I greatly respect your work, and I learned a lot from reading your book.
There we are, Steve. You want to come back on that? Got a few, another question from Brian M7SEY. I wonder, could magnetic materials be orbiting around the core of the sun on the inside, so deep the only way it's revealed is spots from the tubes?
Well, I wave my arms. I'm not a solar physicist, so let me respond with that proviso. Could be. I think that there's a couple of things. Most of listening, your mom probably said, do not stick your head in a fire just because your friend does, right? Well, solar physicists have not stuck their heads in the sun. We have a set of probes. I think the Parker probe is one, and trying to figure out what's going on inside the sun makes me think of Albert Einstein's metaphor for what science is about. And I used to teach this in courses, and I gave what my students said was the most challenging assignment that they had ever had in all of university. I had an old pocket watch, and I'd pass it around. I'd say, take notes, write down what you want to, and pass it on. Einstein said that science was a lot like looking at a pocket watch, feeling its cover, listening to it make the ticking sound, thinking about what is this and how does it work? And yet we're never able to lift the cover on the pocket watch to see what's inside. And I used to give my students the first week of course an assignment to write a 1-page, no more than 1-page, theory of what that was, but they could not use the term watch. And if they used the concept of time, they had to bootstrap it without knowing that that was the watch. Extremely difficult, no? So that may be a good idea. We have similar ideas about the Earth, do we not? We've had some fictional movies, Journey to the Center of the Earth, and all kinds of ideas. So the magnetic flux tube idea that you heard me talk about, and certainly many solar physicists think must be there. We can't directly observe it, but it must be there in some way to transport certain parts of the plasma from one part of the sun to another. Certainly there's something going on there. We can guess about what it is and make some if-then logic statements. So that sounds like a very credible thought.
All right. Well, there we are. Brian, thank you for your comment. You've got a good answer there, a comprehensive answer from Frank. I don't know whether you know Jim Bacon, G3YLA, is a well-known meteorologist in this country, Frank. He was a television weatherman for many years, but as I said, a meteorologist in his own right, and he's a member of our club as well. And he's got a question for you here. Very thought-provoking analysis. He says, if the length amplitude of a cycle is determined by its predecessor, is this method able to give hints of a multi-cycle trend?
Wow, what a great question. Great question. Here's my response. David asked me about my background picture. I live on a lake, and that's a duck. It's actually a goose from Canada that moved here and decided to stay. There are some questions that you have where that's a good metaphor. So you should duck when you get a real tough question. This is not that tough. I can just give you a pretty straightforward answer. I think the potential is there. Here is where the work is at. The Macintosh team is now trying to work backwards and create measurements of when the previous terminators occurred. So then when there's a cycle, just like meteorologists would do, I used to teach meteorology students who would come down and take my GIS and remote sensing classes. When you get enough of those data, then you can look and see what the prediction characteristics might be. And I think there's hope for that. But right now, they're just creating the data. So maybe we'll see in maybe after this cycle when this particular team continues to do it. The thing about a new paradigm, and I've said this before, and I think this is a good time to reiterate it. If Scott McIntosh, heaven forbid, were run over by a big truck and he left us, his theory would not. When you get things published, other people, and they seem to have currency in science. That is, if there was a new meteorological forecast method, I'm sure the questioner would say, let me look at that and let me see how I might use it. When it has some currency as a paradigm, new people jump on board. And when that happens, they create new data, new analyses. Some works out, some doesn't. Some says you need to change the theory, this, that, and the other. But the idea of a multi-cycle forecast is a very, very good question. And I'm certainly hopeful that once the data are there, I've certainly volunteered as a statistician to work with Scott's team and do anything I can to let's find out.
As you say, we're going to need to wait to find out. Frank, it's been a fascinating journey tonight. Lots of compliments and thanks for you. Chris G0DWV says that was great, informative and fun explanation. Fantastic. And lots of other people feel the same, I'm absolutely sure. I think that covers all of the questions and points that we've been sent specifically, but I'd like to thank you once again for a really fascinating presentation, certainly very thought-provoking. And as you say...
Thank you, David. And I greatly appreciate those comments. Your president has hornswoggled me into coming back at some point in the future, so I hope that I haven't ruined my presence for the future one. I'll be talking about transmit noise and some new analyses that I've finished working a little bit with Rob Sherwood in that, so maybe that will be interesting as well. Thank you for spending your time. It's the most precious commodity any of us have.
Very true. Many, many thanks, Frank. Thank you very much indeed to Frank.
7-3.
K4FMH. Thank you. And there we are. That's something to think about for definite, isn't it?
It is.
Many thanks to all of you for watching and your comments and your questions as well. Just to run over then what's happening in the club for the next few days. So Saturday, it's that contest, AFS contest on SSB between 1 and 5 p.m. On Sunday, the GB2RS news at 7 o'clock on GB3MB. Monday Night Net, also on GB3MB at 7:30. And at 8:30, the CW Net on 3.543 megahertz. And then next Wednesday, a week from tonight, we'll be meeting in person at the CNS school with a social plus an informal workshop on repeaters with Mark G0LGJ and James M0ZAH. So we hope to see some of you then. But I think that's all. And just don't forget to keep sending us your news and your pictures and anything funny that you see as well. We'd love to share them here on NARC Live. We'll see you again in 2 weeks' time. But for now, from Tammy M0TC.
Bye-bye.
And from me, David G7ERP, take care of yourselves. Look after. Bye-bye.